Welcome to the Hobby Hour. My name is Jim Grinnell, and I'm the Dean of the Hobby School of Public Affairs at the University of Houston. Joining me today is New York University sociologist, Professor Guillermina Jasso. We're here to discuss the multifaceted impact of immigration policy. As a leading expert in this field, Professor Jasso will share insights from the new Immigrant Survey, the first national longitudinal survey of immigrants in the United States. She will also highlight the significance of interdisciplinary research and quantitative work, as well as the importance of training the next generation of public policy leaders. Now, about our speaker, Professor Jasso, who's also known as Willie, and we're gonna stick to that because we've known each other for 25 years now. But Willie is the Silver Professor of Arts and Science and Professor of Sociology at New York University. Her interests include basic social behavioral theory, inequality, distributive justice, international migration, mathematical methods for theoretical analysis, and factorial survey methods for empirical analysis. Willie has made significant contributions to the demography of immigration to America. She has been published widely in scholarly journals and served on several prestigious panels, including advising the National Science Foundation. And that's where we met. She gave a talk on justice, and she did it in a way that incorporated measuring justice, which is a very difficult thing to do. And I was skeptical walking in, but she blew me away, and I've been a fan ever since. Willie is also a research associate at the Hobby School of Public Affairs, and she's been a frequent contributor to our EITM Summer Institutes. So welcome, Willie.
Thank you so much. I am so happy to be here talking with you.
Let's talk about your background first. This is, I think for our students, it's important to know your journey and what you've done. To start with, were you born in Laredo, Texas? Okay. And your parents were they immigrants from Mexico?
Yes.
Okay. And your father, what kind of business did he run?
Well, my parents had a soft drink business.
Wow.
My father had actually invented the name of the brand, Popo Size. Popo after the wonderful volcano in Mexico, Popocatépetl, and size because his innovation was to have a very, very large soda. Not a little one like Coke, but a big one with wonderful, wonderful flavors.
So was education encouraged? Because your parents, did they have high school degrees, both of them, or no?
We're talking about a completely different historical time. Right. When they grew up, there was no possible education beyond the 6th grade where they lived. But my parents loved learning, and they loved history and literature. They read an enormous amount, and they loved music. My mother was actually a wonderful, wonderful singer, soprano, and she took voice lessons most of her adulthood. And as was possible at the time, she would sing in recitals in Laredo, but nothing more was possible. It was not considered, shall we say, appropriate.
So learning was encouraged in a big way in your household by your parents. Reading, all those sorts of things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I have been extremely lucky. I had amazing parents, and so many of the people around me were also amazing, including my only sibling, my treasured sister, who's amazing. Now, don't get me wrong. No one ever, jumped up and down about learning or anything. It was simply in the air. It was simply in the bedtime stories we were told. As I said, my parents loved to read. And in fact, for persons with very, very little formal schooling, they were unusually well educated and among the best educated people I have ever known. And this is because they read so widely. So, for example, our bedtime stories were typically stories from the Iliad. And you can do no better than starting with the Iliad. This is the beginning of thinking about the human experience and writing it down. My father was also a very big fan of Joan of Arc.
Hmm.
And so as a child, I learned everything there was to know at that time about Joan of Arc. And as I said, my mother was a wonderful musician. By the way, she had perfect pitch, which is
Wow.
incredible.
Wow.
And she could play on the piano anything she heard instantly. Moreover, if the circumstances required, she could instantly transpose higher or lower
Wow.
so that others could join in and sing. So from my mother, I learned an enormous amount about music history. Um, to this day, I am utterly devoted to Bach, for example. Um, as a child, I preferred Beethoven, but I must say something happened when I became a scholar, and then I appreciated Bach much more, and I can't go a day without Bach. In fact, I have a colleague who's originally from Spain, who has as a tag on her email, "Ni un solo día sin Bach."
So you go to high school, and in college was encouraged, I'm assuming, by both your mother and your father. Is that correct?
Um, unfortunately, my mother died young.
Oh.
She died when I was in the ninth grade. Uh, high school was amazing. It was my first year uh, not in Catholic school. And I have to say here, I had the most wonderful Catholic schooling and Catholic teachers. There were three orders in particular with whom I studied. Um, Kindergarten and pre-primer from the Salesian sisters. Uh, then uh, second through part of the seventh grade with the Ursuline sisters. And then I switched to another school with the Congregation of Divine Providence, CDPs. Later, when I went to college, I chose to go to the college run by the CDPs
Okay.
in San Antonio, Our Lady of the Lake. But in between, I had a fantastic high school experience. And again, I was extremely lucky. I had fabulous teachers. I had teachers, for example, who were experts in Chaucer. I
Hmm.
had teachers who were experts in Jane Austen. And all of this stayed with me. And I remember high school, entering this large public high school was like going to a bazaar, and going from stall to stall to stall. So my first year there, which was sophomore year, I joined the French club, the slide rule club, the tennis club, on and on and on. Everything was so extraordinary. It also turned out that I loved. Well, I had known this since early childhood. I had always been cast in plays in all my schooling. And by the way, not that this matters, but it takes us back to Shakespeare. Um, During the time that I was in an all girls school, which was most of my childhood, um, I was usually cast as boys um, or man. And so I became very good at impersonating anybody of any age, anything. Then in high school, which was, of course, co ed, the large public high school, at that time there was only one high school in public high school in Laredo. And I think that was extremely wonderful. So there were no disparities across schools, shall we say. We were all there. We were all friends. It didn't matter who your parents were. We were all friends. So I was cast in several plays, and I had the huge honor of um, competing in Texas Interscholastic League. I won awards for my portrayal of Madame Butterfly, for
Oh, wow.
example. And I also participated in plays in Spanish and also won awards for those.
Wow.
So it was a wonderful, wonderful time. And then I became very interested in high school, in student government. And in fact, my nickname, Willie, comes from a ninth grade speech teacher who couldn't pronounce my name. See, up until that time, the nuns, for example, would say Wilhelmina. They could say
Right.
that. But this one teacher simply couldn't say anything. So he said, "All right, from now on, you're Willie." So I had met a few days earlier another student in this this was public junior high. My first year in public junior high, I was in the ninth grade. I had met this eighth grader, redheaded, and she said to me after she heard this story, she said, "Oh, that's wonderful, because I can be your campaign manager, and our slogan is going to be Win with Willie." So then there were posters everywhere, Win with Willie. And this stayed, throughout high school. And then in college, I was very active in student government as well. So it was a truly more, I was really extremely lucky. And of course, the Sisters of Divine Providence who ran Our Lady of Valais College, they included some top scholars. The chair of the sociology department, with whom I spent a lot of time in courses and out of courses, she, for one of those years, was president of the American Catholic Sociological Association.
Mm.
She was well known all over the world for her work, wrote several books, etc. The chair of the English department, Sister Generosa, was a published author, biographer of the founder of the order, and absolutely top notch. The nun from whom I took Latin, she was an expert in some obscure Latin author, I no longer remember who, but had published some of the things she had found while going through old archives. So these were people completely committed
Right.
to the life of the mind. Now, remember, in those days, Catholic education meant a grounding in philosophy and theology. Logic was a required course first semester freshman year for everyone. I fell in love with logic. I quickly saw all the fun in different types of arguments. I could go Barbara, Chalarin, Dari, Ferrio, etc., etc. It was all marvelous. It was a new kind of intellectual bazaar. I might also mention a little footnote, which is that in those days, the Catholic Church forbade the reading of certain books.
Hmm.
Well, as you might imagine, these were the books I wanted to read.
Right.
Kant, for example, etc. The library had them, but they were under lock and key. And so one had to go to the director of the library, who was a wonderful nun, and ask for permission. And then she would check with your own advisors and your own teachers, do you really need to be reading Kant? And they were all very indulgent. And they quietly said, look, if we don't give her permission to read these, what's going to happen is on Saturday, she's going to take the bus downtown to the bookstores and stand there all day. In those days, there weren't chairs in bookstores.
Right.
And stand there all day and read this. So they gave me permission. So it was a wonderful, wonderful atmosphere.
So you graduate from college,
Yes,
but you didn't pursue a PhD right away, did you?
that's correct. And everyone wanted me to go to graduate school immediately. The dean of students, the wonderful nun who was dean of students, who by the way was a natural scientist, she begged me to let her nominate me for a Woodrow Wilson fellowship. She said, you can get in anywhere, and it'll be. But somehow I knew better. See, I had been accelerated through school. I was really young, really immature. It I knew deeply, without verbalizing it the way I do now, that I couldn't. I graduated from college at 19. Imagine me going to the University of Chicago.
Mm.
Um, it would not have worked at all in any way. There would have been, how shall I put it gently, uh, not only much more mature people, but also a wide variety of people with very different values.
Mm.
I needed to continue for a while the sheltered life I had led all my life.
Mm.
By the way, my parents were incredibly strict.
Mm.
Um, and of course, I did my best at rebelling,
Right.
but they won. And I think it was wonderful. In fact, I sometimes think now our young people would be better off if there were chaperones around.
Right. 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 So the PhD, you pursue the PhD at what age?
Well, first, after I had my wonderful three children and a very interesting and rewarding early marriage, um, I decided to go to the University of Notre Dame for a master's. Okay. Again, you notice that I'm taking, these are steps that I'm taking one at a time.
Right.
The nun, the former president of the American Clerical Association, begged me to let her let her write on my behalf to Columbia. She had been sending and continued to send top students to Columbia. She was friendly with the top Columbia faculty, and I said no. I cannot see myself, living in New York City and in that environment. I was, I had read enough. Certainly, I knew from literature class what happened in the village in those days.
Right. Right.
And so, in some ways, I knew what was right for me. So I go to Notre Dame. I meet these fantastic professors. I had such a wonderful time. Got my master's, and then decided I'm ready. And then I went to Johns Hopkins, and that's where I got my PhD.
How old were you when you graduated with your PhD?
Well, there was a long hiatus from graduating college at 19.
Right.
I got my PhD in 1974, so I was 32.
So your children must have been quite young, though, right? So you're raising three children and you're going to get your PhD?
Yes,
Did you sleep at all?
yes, and they were wonderful.
That's something else. And you did it in 4 years.
Well, actually, at Hopkins, I did it in 3
Three?
because remember, I had come in with a master's.
Master's, correct.
Yeah.
So how did you get involved in studying the sociology of immigration?
Well, Jim, after I saw that you wanted to talk about this, I said to myself, this is actually a wonderful Houston story. So if you'll indulge me, let me tell this little Houston story.
Sure.
At Hopkins, Hopkins sociology, by the way, at that time was known as one of the top 2 departments in the country in cutting edge quantitative empirical methods. So I learned everything that was new then from the top people who were producing this new knowledge. I became an expert in a method, a method that My thesis advisor had invented the
Oh,
factorial survey method, also known as the vignette method, for studying beliefs and judgments, etc. And I was very, very interested in questions of fairness, which obviously got me into questions of inequality, which is highly, highly quantitative.
right.
And I loved all of that. Okay. So my first 4 papers, I went back last night and looked at my CV. My first 4 papers have nothing to do with immigration.
Hmm.
And in fact, although my parents, I now know and say, were immigrants from Mexico, in those days when I was growing up, that was not the term that was used. I never thought of my parents as immigrants. In fact, the Texas school books of the time uh, had a wonderful chapter on immigrants, which were who were all people in the Lower East Side of New York and portrayed as illiterate, drunk, slovenly, and thank God for the Women's Temperance Union. So, that had been, and my parents and everyone I knew, okay, most of whom had roots in another country, not only Mexico, but other countries. Laredo had a wonderful palette of ancestries and origins. And as I said, we were all friends. And interestingly, no matter what your ancestry, in Laredo, everyone was bilingual. Everybody spoke Spanish and English,
Right.
which was fabulous. You don't appreciate what a gift it is, to know another, and in particular to know a Romance language. It,
Right.
it's it's extraordinary. So anyway, I have my first job after Hopkins. I go to Columbia. I start publishing on fairness and inequality, and I had kept in touch with a wonderful classmate from college who was at St. Mary's University, which was the nearby all boys school. We had been active in student government together. He and I were among the founders of a group called Students for Civil Liberties. We, in fact, designed and executed the stand-ins at movie theaters so that Blacks, who were not called Blacks at that time, could sit anywhere they wanted.
Hmm.
So we would go in teams, one Black student and one white student, up to the box office. And the white student would say, I'd like to buy 2 tickets. And the cashier, and remember, this is Texas, where most people are friendly and kind. The cashier would say, I'll be happy to sell you 2 tickets, but you cannot sit together.
Hmm.
So then we'd walk to the end of the line, and then the next team would go up, on and on and on. So as you can imagine, this was highly disruptive.
Right.
And in fact, within a few months, the group of motion picture theater owners of San Antonio decided to integrate their theaters. So we had done something
Right.
valuable, and I had stayed in touch with my friend, whom we all knew as Lone. Well, guess what? After a stint in the Peace Corps in the Philippines, by the way, where he worked with Larry Fuchs, who would later become very important in the study of immigration.
Right.
He goes to Houston, becomes a politician, is elected to office. And then the new president, Jimmy Carter, appoints him head of the Immigration Service,
Oh boy.
commissioner of the Immigration Service, the INS. So he calls me one day in August 1977 and says, can you take I was in Baltimore at that time in the summer, even though my job was in New York at Columbia. And he said, can you take the train, meet me? We can talk for about an hour or 2. there's something I want to discuss with you. So I said, sure. So I take the train. He and his driver, which was a fabulous experience for a young scholar, pick me up at Union Station. And he says to me, I'm building a staff and I can have, I forget, 4 or 5 people. And I'd like very much for you to be on it. And I said to him, but I don't know anything about immigration.
Mm.
And he said, you know more than you think you know. And the rest you can learn.
Right.
So he talked me into it. And I spent 2 years as one of the special assistants to the commissioner. My purview was all things research related, but I also did some policy work and I also did some history work. For example, going back to read the official history of World War II,
Wow.
official history, in order to see exactly what the background was for the promises that had been made to certain persons in the Philippines, in the Philippine theater, about having access to green cards and citizenship in the US.
Right.
So I did all these things and I loved them. So I had promised I would do this for 2 years. So close to the end of the second year, Congress voted to establish the US Select Commission on Immigration and Refugee Policy. They invited Father Hesburgh,
Oh boy.
president of Notre Dame, to be
Yeah.
president. Father Hesburgh appointed Larry Fuchs to be
Right.
staff director. And of course, Lone and I met with Larry to talk about the makeup and the future work of to make a long story short, I then served 1 year on the commission staff. So I think of those 3 years in Washington as an incredible postdoc on immigration.
Right.
And as I said, it's a Houston story.
Yes. Yes. So let's talk about the new immigrant survey. Um, what is it? I mean, all the details, and how useful tools. I assume since it's longitudinal. Anything longitudinal to me is like it's the gold standard. So, but what did it? What's it? How long has it been around? I mean, things like how many people, how many countries are represented. All these interesting things. I mean, so give us A to Z on the new immigrant survey.
Okay, I'll try to be as brief as possible.
Okay.
The design, which by the way has roots in which in back at the during my time at the commission, there were 2 directors of research, me and someone else. And the 2 of us worked out a design for a new kind of survey that had never been attempted. At that time, it didn't work. There was no funding. But subsequently, for 10, 12 years, every time there was a panel on immigration, either at NSF, NIH, the famous Academy panel on immigration, there was further thinking. And all this thinking coalesced into what would become the design of the new immigrant survey. The basic idea would be every 4 or 5 years, take a probability sample from the set of brand new green card recipients, brand new LPRs, legal permanent residents. Interview them right away, and then interview them every 4 or 5 years. We did a pilot, which was on the cohort of 1996. And then we did the first really full implementation of this design on the cohort of 2003. Now, it's a random sample. So as you can imagine, all countries of the world are represented.
Right.
Now, we had a rule that every person, the green card recipient, that person's spouse, that person's age eligible children, meaning eligible to be interviewed,
Right.
something like children age 8 to 12, that every person would be interviewed in the language of their choice.
Hmm.
We learned later, tallying all the invoices, 95 languages were used.
Wow.
So you can imagine this is a formidable effort.
Yes.
Now, the advantage of this cohort-based design is that it prevents the entangling of cohort and experience effects.
Right.
It's clean, it's clear, it's pristine. Now, it's very, very important to do two things. One is interview the same people periodically. The original design said every 4 to 5 years,
Right.
because then you know, are they still in the US? What are they doing? What are their jobs? Has their marriage held? What about their children? Have they sponsored any new relatives?
Hmm.
Are they taking steps to become citizens? Etc., etc. Moreover, the second really important thing is every few years, take a new cohort, because the immigrants in 2010 may not be the same as the immigrants from 2003.
Right.
Well, everything was going fine. We were working with the complete cooperation and incredible dedication from the statistical staff at DHS, Department of Homeland Security. So, for example, when we did the first second wave of the 2003 cohort, we had access with a method that we designed to protect anonymity of the respondents, but we had access to the DHS database on address changes. Now, as you know, if you're going to be interviewing people, knowing where they're living is critically important.
Right.
Well, to make a long story short, sometime, and I no longer remember, and this may be a protection, sometime around 2009 or 2010, the federal government instituted new privacy guidelines, and it completely reneged on its commitment, which we had in writing, which
Right.
I still have, to let us access their databases, both for drawing new cohorts, that is the set of new
Right.
green card recipients, and for following up on the older cohorts. So as I put it when I discuss it, the NIS is in hiatus. I have not given up hope that some enlightened legislators will see exactly how useful this
Right.
is and was, and how important it is, and how truly harmless our procedures were.
Right.
We really, really care. We researchers, the co-principal investigators, really, really care about protecting the privacy and anonymity of our respondents. Nothing is going to shake us from that.
Right.
And so, as I said, we had worked out procedures that would enable us to get access to certain DHS files and then continue. So at the moment, it's in hiatus. Now, the data are available and they're wonderful. And anyone interested in studying the experience of immigrants would benefit from doing some work, at least some work, with data from the New Immigrant Survey. You can Google on New Immigrant Survey, and this will take you immediately to the Princeton website.
Right.
Now, the data are not deposited at ICPSR, so the data can be obtained from ICPSR, but the complete documentation is at the Princeton website. And again, any student who thinks at any time in the future they may be interested in these kinds of data, I would say, go to the Princeton website and download all the code books and questionnaires. Extremely valuable. Now, in the meantime, people like me are very worried about, what can we do in the meantime?
Right.
So I've been working on a new paper with a collaborator and presented it, for example, last week at the demography meetings on using DHS data, and I'll come in a minute to exactly what that is, in order to do part of what the New Immigrant Survey did and can do. Basically, whenever a person goes through the process of getting a green card, that person and their sponsor have to submit mountains of forms with enormous information. So, for example, marital history, residential history, job history, okay? All questions that were asked in the New Immigrant Survey. Well, that information one could get from DHS.
Mm-hmm.
What one cannot get from DHS is items such as getting to know something about their language and language history. What language did you speak with the man who raised you?
Right.
What language did you speak with the woman who raised you? What language do you speak with your spouse, for example? Okay? Plus religion questions, which DHS obviously does not ask,
Right.
and that for a very good reason. So I've been working on, again with a collaborator, on a design for doing part of what the NIS did using exclusively DHS data. It could not be done. This is something that can only be done by DHS.
Right.
We do not have access to those data. But what we've been doing is going systematically through the forms that are filled out in the immigration process and seeing what information there is in order to figure out answers to questions that are of scientific importance as well as policy importance. Let me give you an illustration of a scientific question and a policy question. And of course, many questions are both relevant to both. A US citizen can sponsor the immigration of a spouse. It has been thought since time immemorial that being married to a US citizen makes integration into the US quicker. Well, there are native-born US citizens who sponsor spouses, and there are foreign-born US citizens who sponsor spouses. Okay?
Right.
The only three pieces of information currently available are one that was obtained by the GAO in 1985, I believe, and then from the New Immigrant Survey in 1996 and in 2003. The proportion of the sponsors of spouses who are native-born versus foreign-born, on the hunch that native-born sponsors may make integration even quicker. So that's fascinating.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Scientific question.
Yeah.
Now, an example of a policy question is that people leave the US. They leave the US much more than anybody thinks. Well, it turns out that when Congress sets limits on immigration, there's this implicit idea of something like carrying capacity. But what they don't take into account is people leaving. So being able to document who leaves, when they leave, do they come back or do they stay gone forever? Do they first become citizens and then leave? Or do they leave before they become citizens? That is completely key to figuring out whether the goals that are implicit in those numerical ceilings are based on reality.
Right.
Now, let me mention just two more things about both the new immigrant survey and this new design using only DHS data. One of the things that we've known for many years from published DHS data, and by the way, for anyone starting out to study immigration, there's nothing better than to read from cover to cover the annual yearbook of immigration statistics. It's fantastic. On the web, free. The first thing that we've known for many years is that most people who get green cards are already living in the US. They are, quote, adjusting status from some temporary status to green card. So what that means is that a design based on LPRs still manages to shed light on the experience of temporary migrants. The second related thing, which we know a little bit about from published data, but much more about from the new immigrant survey, is that over a third of new green card recipients have previously been in the US unauthorized.
Oh boy.
In the 2003 cohort, it's something like 38%. Okay, so again, what this tells us is that a design that's focused only on LPRs, because that's the only way we can have a random sample, that such a design still manages to illuminate the unauthorized experience. And I'll give you an example, a finding from the 2003 cohort that I published. And that is that defining English fluency as choosing to be interviewed in English and completing the entire interview in English, okay? Using that as our measure, this is a very restrictive measure, okay? Using that as our measure of English fluency, those young children, 8 to 12, among those children whose parent had previous unauthorized experience are more likely to be fluent in English than other children. And so that sheds enormous light. That means those children are learning English. Now, we don't yet, we interpret it in several ways, but we don't yet know. It'll take much more information and future surveys to learn more about that. But at the moment, there's two main interpretations. One is that they see the hardships endured by their unauthorized parents, and they're making sure that they will have an easier path.
Yeah.
The second interpretation is that they do a lot of translation for their parents. And in fact, there's a wonderful book written by someone that I went to college with at Our Lady of the Lake, who is now a professor of literature at Stanford. On the title of this wonderful book she wrote is Gifted Interpreters.
So 95 languages. What are the sizes of the cohorts? So you had a pile. I assume the pile was smaller, but the cohorts were how many thousand?
Okay. We drew a sample of over 12,000. We had approximately 68, 69% response rate. So our adult sample has about 8,600 main green card recipients in it, plus their spouses, if they're in the household, plus their children 8 to 12, plus information that the respondents provide on their entire extended family, not only in the US, but in other countries. And of course, as you might imagine, complete information on remittances. Right. That's the sort of thing that would not be available with a design based on purely DHS data, because DHS doesn't inquire about remittances. But with the new immigrant survey, we could do that. Yeah.
So to wrap this part of our discussion up, what were some of the biggest surprises you had with this wonderful data? So for the folks out there, if you don't know what the term longitudinal analysis is, you're basically tracking the same people over a period of time. And it's fantastic. I mean, because you learn how people evolve, how they change, resilience. I mean, all kinds of things you can now learn by tracking the same people over time. But Willie, give me a big surprise that you like, wow, that was really something that I would not have thought of this.
That's a very good question. I am sure there are many such surprises. Okay, I will mention two.
Okay.
One of them, because remember, I haven't analyzed all the data. There's lots and lots of scholars all over the world working on the data. And so, we all have to read each other's work. But one of them is that Black immigrants from Africa are extremely well educated. Now, what's important about this? What we did was we had a subset of immigrants who were Black from the Caribbean and a subset Black from Africa, and then we compared, their characteristics, etc. Here are two or three important things about this. There is in social science this idea that there is a strict correlation between skin color and achievement. And of course, there's lots of evidence to counter that, but the new immigrant survey evidence is particularly important because it's evidence that, in fact, the best educated of the immigrants are the darkest in skin color.
Interesting.
And so that's, again, fascinating. Other things, let me mention two little things. In immigration, the person who qualifies for the green card is known as the principal. If the principal has a spouse and minor children, this means children unmarried and under 21, in certain immigrant classifications, there are visas available for the spouse and children. This is well known. This is the law. Okay? Not in all classifications. For example, if a US citizen sponsors the immigration of a parent, that parent cannot bring a spouse and minor children. Okay? one of the really interesting things is that because there are also financial requirements for getting a green card. And the financial requirements in certain categories, which is the majority of categories, family-based categories, the requirement is based on the immigrant's family size and the sponsor's family size. And there's a provision for what's called a joint sponsor.
Okay.
If, immigrant and sponsor can't quite make it. To make a long story short, it turns out that some young children don't get green cards.
Hmm.
They would have been eligible. They were eligible, but the financial requirement said no. Well, that's something to think about,
Right.
Now, in terms of the science, we looked more closely at this using the second wave data on the 2003 cohort. And it looked like, although it's too soon, and because it's too soon, we haven't published it. We're still working on it, trying to figure it out. But it looks like boys are more likely than girls to be included in the green card recipient subset of the children.
Hmm.
Again, this raises lots and lots of questions for policy, etc. Our tentative title for that paper is Remit or Reunify.
Yeah.
Because if they don't bring the children, they'll be sending money.
Right. Right.
Other interesting thing that I learned, I knew, because I've been studying US immigration law for many years, I knew about conditional residence. These are green card recipients whose green card is only good for 2 years. And before that 2-year period expires, they have to file for removal of the restrictions. Most of these conditional restrictions are people who got their green card due to a marriage of less than 2 years duration. Okay?
Mhm.
And by the way, some of you may know about the 90-day visa on TV, which is related to this. Well, if you read, at first reading, it looks like to remove these conditions, they file a particular form. Okay, so the New Immigrant Survey asked, did you file for this form? Was it approved or denied? If you only look at the persons who file, then it looks normal. Very few people are denied. And that's in fact what you see from the government published performance data files on that specific form. I think it's form 751. However, if you read more deeply, it turns out there is also in immigration law something called expeditious naturalization. And certain spouses of US citizens, not everyone, and certain sponsors of spouses of US citizens in particular jobs. There's a long list that the State Department keeps, for example, on who qualifies for this provision of expeditious naturalization. So it turns out that if you are a researcher for any of the top research universities in the US, then and you sponsor a spouse, then if you and your spouse have to be away, et cetera, there are provisions for the spouse to become a citizen earlier and without satisfying the residency requirements for naturalization.
Interesting.
Well, we are also obviously asked, have you filed for naturalization? And Have you become a citizen? So guess what? If you combine all of that information, it looks like a non-trivial proportion of these spousal conditional residents are not having their conditions removed, and they are becoming removable, deportable, losing their green cards.
Right.
That's what it looks like. Again, more work to be done. We haven't published that one yet. We're still working on it, but that's how it looks. Now, notice here, you don't learn about expeditious naturalization in general. You really have to go rummaging through the USCIS policy manual, and then which is linked to the Code of Law and to the Code of Federal Regulations. And then you end up, at the State Department list of the husband's jobs overseas, the wife's jobs overseas, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
So all of that is incredibly interesting, fascinating, both for science and for policy. And then finally, the last thing I will say on this, derivative citizenship. This is one of my favorite. You see, naturalization is only for people who are 18 and older. Okay? Now, there has always been provision with more or less restrictiveness for the children of US citizens to become citizens automatically, called derivative citizenship. The last piece of legislation enacted into law by President Clinton was, in fact, the Child Citizenship Act, which made derivative citizenship less restrictive, such that only one citizen parent is needed for the child, who there are other conditions,
Right.
age of the child, marital, blah, blah. But only one parent is required for the child to automatically become a citizen.
Yes.
Every year when I teach my spring immigration course to undergraduates, there is invariably one student who, when we talk about this, says, I was a derivative citizen. My older siblings had to work to master, civics and history, but I just became a citizen. And it turns out that there are two subtypes of derivative citizens. One is, and again, this is based on the law that President Clinton signed. Under the law, a child otherwise eligible, at the moment that child gets a green card, that child becomes a derivative citizen.
Yeah.
Now, that's extraordinary. So, for example, now when I look at the numbers of new child immigrants in my favorite Table 7 of the DHS Statistical Yearbook, I ask myself, I wonder how many of these became citizens at the instant they got their green card. And then, of course, the rest, the second subtype, are the ones whose parent naturalizes. And then, if otherwise eligible, they become derivative citizens.
Last question, and this is from our audience. How has immigration policy changed since the turn of the century in the United States?
The first thing I will say, somewhat humorously, is that for me, turn of the century still means 1900.
Right. Maybe do both.
Right. It's an excellent question. And I've written with a collaborator a history paper, came out in 2006, that goes into this in great detail. I'll give you the highlights in a minute. And then 2 years ago, I published another paper that's widely accessible. It's an open access frontiers paper titled analyzing migration restriction regimes. The history of US immigration law is the history of restriction. Now, there are two kinds of restriction. Restriction based on personal characteristics, such as being from a particular part of the world, or being a vagrant, or something else that's personal. The second type of restriction is numerical, no more than so many. Well, the US first had restriction in 1875, and it was purely personal restriction, paupers, etc. There was, as you'll read, lots of discontent and a strong lobby for greater restriction. So there then came a series of quota laws, starting in 1921 and then solidified in 1924, after several other trials, that basically did the following. It established a two-tier system. Certain relatives of US citizens would be outside numerical limitations, and everyone else would be subject to highly restrictive numerical limitations. But that law was applicable only to the Eastern Hemisphere. So natives of the Western Hemisphere could keep coming. As Sloan used to say, his father, paid his nickel at the turnstile and came to live in the US. That was all you needed to do. That was, not this incredible apparatus that we have now.
Right.
So, in brief, continuing with the history, from 1921 to about 1968, which was when a law passed in 1965 went into effect, different immigration restriction regimes for Eastern and Western Hemisphere, and Western Hemisphere could come in, only liable to personal-based restriction. I'll let someone else, and Jim, you'd probably be terrific at this, to work through the legislative history of the 1965 Act to see exactly what it was that happened in Texas. It happened in Texas, a late night compromise in a smoke-filled room that led to imposing numerical ceilings on natives of the Western Hemisphere.
Interesting.
So at first, and by the way, you can see all this with all the correct dates and figures, etc., in those two papers, the history paper from 2006 and the open access frontiers paper. So at first, this meant that immediate relatives could still come in. Now, meanwhile, the definition of immediate relative and, outside the quota immigrant is changing. In the early days, opera singers and professors were outside the quota. Then they brought them inside the quota. The Border Patrol was founded in 1924, I think,
Yes.
to prevent immigration of Eastern Hemisphere people via Canada and Mexico. It was not founded to keep out Canadians and Mexicans. It was founded to keep out these people who said, I look like I could be native of Mexico or native of Canada.
Mm-hmm.
So, so then there's the numerical ceilings, and it's something, I forget the exact number, maybe 120,000 at first for the Western Hemisphere, and 170,000 for the rest of the world. Then that changed a few years later, and that's all in those two papers.
Right, right.
And so basically, the only big change since then, two big changes. One, since 1968, the next big change was 1977, when natives of the Western Hemisphere were brought inside the category system for the numerically limited visas. See, before that, it was first come, first served.
Right.
And you didn't need a sponsor,
Hmm.
which in many ways was wonderful. We can also talk about why that needs study. Okay? But then 1977, suddenly into the category system. And then a single world ceiling, etc. So 1977 was that big watershed year. And then the last big change was in 1990. Now, I'm skipping over some very important things, like the marriage fraud amendments, which led to the conditional residence, like RERA, etc.
Right.
But in 1990, expanded immigration, many more visas allocated for employment purposes, green cards based on employment. Although, by the way, again, nobody gets this quite right. Those visa ceilings are for the principal and the spouse and children. So, when we hear some politician say 140,000 new workers, that's going to kill our economy, or whatever. Right. Well, it's not 140,000 workers. It's the principal and the spouse and children. And even if all spouses worked, they're still, children are still there. They're not working. So those have been the big things. Now, one of my main points in the Frontiers paper, made almost as a side thought, is that there is a hint of instability in any migration restriction regime. This has to be thought about very carefully. So you can see the history of immigration as people going in and out of numerically unlimited and in and out of the numerically limited classes. That's because, in a free society, there are going to be strong lobbies for persons of new immigrants of particular characteristics.
Right.
Okay? We certainly don't want to give up our free society. But it does make one wonder if any migration restriction regime has even a hint of inherent instability, then this does mean we've got to think more deeply about this. And one final thought, watching very closely what's happening with refugees and asylees around the world. Now, footnote, when refugees and asylees are first accepted into the US, they have a temporary visa.
Mm-hmm.
They then have to adjust to the permanent, the green card. Okay? Now, at the same time that I'm looking closely at this happening around the world, I am also, as as a scholar, I have a very active life of conferences around the world, certainly before the pandemic. Um, and it's amazing how many people around the world, scholars, have difficulty getting visas for all countries, not only for the US.
Hmm.
It's not easy to get a visa anywhere, and it gets harder and harder every year. Now, scholarly progress depends on the free exchange of information.
Right.
Without it, we're nothing.
Right.
So the thought has come to me, and I've been racing it quietly because I'm not, I'm not out, campaigning. The thought has come to me that what we really need is a philanthropic effort that would establish a network of conference centers around the world, in islands or in some protected territory where they do not need the visa from any country. And I'm always reminded Leonard Bernstein in his last years
Hmm.
liked to say that he was a citizen of the world
Yes.
and that he couldn't wait to have a passport that said citizen of the world. Citoyen du monde. That's what Bernstein would say.
Yeah.
Um, a network of conference centers staffed by refugees and asylees,
All right.
so that they would have a place to go immediately, where depending on their age and their skills, they would either go to work immediately instead of this sitting around for 18 months for processing of something, go to work immediately or go to school immediately. And my model, and I'm going to come back to Houston now, the University of Houston has this wonderful hospitality school.
Yes.
I think the first one was the one at Cornell, but now they're springing up everywhere because the more people travel, the more important it becomes for staff to get the skills that they
Right.
need
Right.
for the hospitality industry.
Right.
So imagine, now I was in New Orleans last week for the demography meetings, and I said to myself, wow, a little island off New Orleans in the Gulf with the University of Houston setting up. Obviously, this would have to be thought about very, very carefully, and there would have to be large, large donor input. And I'm thinking UN could provide this, global passport. Anyone can come to that island. They don't have to qualify to come to the US.
All right.
And because it takes so many skills to run a conference center. We saw today, for example, the crew making this wonderful exchange possible.
Right.
Not to mention food, etc. There's scope for an enormous variety of skills, which again can be taught. And there would have to be a school, etc. Now, the US has this wonderful experience setting up military bases all around the world.
Yeah.
And in fact, commanders of military bases like to say that they're like mayors. And basically, what happens when a military base is set up, you get a school, you get a little convenience store, the PX or the BX, you get a chapel, you get a movie theater, you get a child care center. This is part of the traditional blueprint for a military installation. The US could donate its experience and skills at setting up these little towns. And one could try it. Of course, there's obviously things to guard against. one would hear immediately about, all the terrorists that one would have to screen, but I have every faith that they could be screened. And frankly, the only rule I would impose, the only one, is that the dedication of these centers would be to human development. And that means that if you're in need of asylum, but you don't think your daughter should be educated, we won't take you.
Yes. Yes.
That's the only rule. Human development comes first for
Yep.
everyone of any age.
Willie's rule. Well, Dr. Jasso, Willie, I want to thank you for an incredible conversation. And we call this the hobby hour, but I didn't want to stop. So we went over, and but I just am so thrilled to talk to you. And I want to thank our audience too for their viewership. And stay tuned for another episode of the Hobby Hour on May 3rd at noon. The topic there will be the 2023 Texas legislative session. You can find more details on our website and social media platforms. Willie, it's been a pleasure.
The pleasure is all mine. And if I can take 30 seconds,
Sure.
I have this fabulous image of Jim. In 2003, I gave a talk at NSF.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that I reported a particular finding, which is a big surprise, the golden number. This was in the study of justice.
Yeah.
But I was too shy. I knew what the golden number was, but I didn't want to call it that. It seemed just, beyond the beyond. So I'm giving this talk. I have the slide. I show the equation. And Jim pipes up from the audience, "That's the golden number." And I thought, yes, that's wonderful. So Jim, you were the first to call it the golden number. And last year, 2022, I finally published the complete description of how that golden number was found in the study of fairness.
Congratulations.
So we owe it to you.
Oh, right. Well, again, a pleasure, and thank God we met 25 years ago. That was just an incredible happenstance.
Thank God for me. Thank you. Thank you.
Take care, Willie.